History has recorded the names of over 400 defeated kings, their battles, their failures, their executions, all documented, studied, taught in classrooms to children who will forget the details but remember the names. We built museums around these men. We carved their faces into mountains. We wrote 10,000 books about what it felt like to be them. The women they left behind? Fewer than 12 have a Wikipedia page. That is not an accident. That is a decision, made deliberately, repeatedly, for over 2,000 years by the people who decided which stories were worth keeping. Now imagine you are one of those women. You are a queen. Not in the fairy tale sense, not the silk gowns and the cheering crowds and the crown that sits perfectly on your head in every portrait. You have real power. Advisors who wait for your word before they speak. A court that fears you almost as much as it fears him. You have spent years learning how to survive inside a palace that never fully trusted you, a foreign bride, a political transaction dressed up as a love story. You gave him heirs. You smiled through banquets where men debated the future of your kingdom like it was a game board and you were a piece on it. You held everything together with your bare hands, while he led armies you were never allowed to command. And then one morning, a rider arrives, dusty, breathless. He will not meet your eyes. Your husband's army has been destroyed, not retreated, not regrouped somewhere beyond the hills to fight another day, destroyed. And the man coming to replace him, the conqueror whose soldiers are already 3 days' march from your walls, he does not negotiate with queens. He does not send flowers or peace treaties or messengers with reasonable terms. He sends one message, and that message has no words. It has only speed. How fast can you run? How much can you carry? How many of your children can you keep alive before he arrives? History remembers what happened to defeated kings. The executions, the humiliations, the heads on stakes displayed at the city gates so that everyone who enters knows exactly who is in charge now. We have paintings of that moment, monuments dedicated to it, entire chapters in every textbook ever written. History does not tell you what happened to their wives. It does not tell you about the women dragged from their thrones and handed to the victors like furniture from a conquered palace. It does not tell you about the ones who chose poison over surrender and mixed it themselves calmly while their ladies-in-waiting wept in the corner. It does not tell you about the ones who sat across from conquerors and negotiated with nothing but their intelligence and kept their children alive anyway. The ones who disappeared so completely that historians spent centuries writing as if they had never existed at all. But they existed. And what happened to them is not a footnote. It is the story. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. You are watching Primeval History, the best dark history channel in the world. Before we follow these women into the darkness that waited for them, we need to understand something. Something that every history book, every documentary, every Hollywood costume drama has deliberately hidden from you behind pretty dresses and candlelit ballrooms. Being a queen was not a privilege. It was a trap. A beautifully decorated, heavily guarded, completely inescapable trap. Think about what that word actually meant in the ancient and medieval world. Queen, consort, royal wife. It sounds like power. It sounds like safety. You are inside the most fortified walls in the kingdom. You are surrounded by servants. You eat the finest food. You wear the finest cloth. From the outside, looking up at your window, you have everything. What you actually have is a role, and that role has one purpose, one single function that justifies your entire existence inside those walls. You produce heirs. You secure alliances. You are the living proof that 2 kingdoms shook hands and decided not to go to war with each other this season. You are a political instrument dressed in gold thread, and everyone in that palace knows it, including you. The moment your husband loses, that instrument becomes worthless. Worse than worthless. You become a liability, a symbol of the old order that the new power needs to erase. A mother of children who have a claim to a throne that someone else now sits on. You are not just inconvenient, you are dangerous, and conquerors throughout history have dealt with dangerous things in a very small number of ways. They destroy them, they control them, or they convert them into tools for their own use. There was no fourth option. And here is what makes this story so much darker than anything they taught you in school. These women knew. They were not naive. They had grown up inside royal courts, some of them since childhood, sent as child brides to foreign palaces before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. They had watched other women fall. They had seen what happened when a king lost a battle and his wife had no plan. They had learned, sometimes from their own mothers, that the only difference between surviving a conquest and disappearing into one was the decision you made in the hours between the rider arriving and the gates opening. Some of them had been preparing for this moment their entire lives, and some of them still did not survive it. The women we are about to meet lived centuries apart, different continents, different cultures, different conquerors standing at their gates, but they all faced the same morning, the same breathless rider, the same impossible calculation. How do you keep yourself alive when everything that made you powerful has just been taken away? The answers they found will change the way you understand power, survival, and what history chose to remember, and what it chose to bury. Pierwsza женщина, Roxana, żona Aleksandra Wielkiego. Let us start with the one who had the furthest to fall. In 327 BC, Alexander the Great was at the peak of something the world had never seen before and has never seen since. He had not lost a single battle, not one. His army had marched from Macedonia, through Persia, through Egypt, through Afghanistan, into the edges of India, and at every single stop the result was the same. The opposing force collapsed, the city opened its gates, the king either surrendered or died. Alexander was not a conqueror in the conventional sense. He was a force of nature wearing armor. And then he saw Roxana. She was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, a man who had been fighting against Alexander, not with him. A captured enemy's daughter. In every cultural framework of the ancient world, that made her property, spoils, something to be used and discarded or sent back to Macedonia as a trophy. Alexander married her, not as a political transaction, not to secure an alliance, though his advisors desperately tried to frame it that way after the fact. He married her because he chose to. In a world where kings took what they wanted and called it strategy, Alexander the Great looked at a girl from a conquered people and decided she would be his queen. For 11 years, Roxana was the most protected woman on earth. Then Alexander died. He was 32 years old, no confirmed successor, no plan. The greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to the borders of India, and its architect was dead on a bed in Babylon before anyone had figured out what came next. What came next was the Diadochi, the successors. 20 years of warfare between Alexander's own generals, men who had fought beside him, eaten beside him, watched him bleed, now tearing his empire apart like wolves over a carcass. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus took Persia, Antigonus took Asia Minor, and every single one of them had a reason to want Roxana and her son dead. Because Roxana had given Alexander a son, a boy named Alexander IV. And that boy, that child, was the last legitimate heir to everything his father had built. As long as Alexander IV was alive, he was a threat to every general who wanted to rule without having to justify himself against a bloodline. And as long as Roxana was alive, she would fight for her son with everything she had. She had already proven that. Within weeks of Alexander's death, while his body was still being prepared for burial, while his generals were still pretending to negotiate, Roxana moved. She summoned Statira, Alexander's Persian royal wife, the daughter of Darius III, the woman who had an equal, if not stronger claim to be the mother of Alexander's heir. She summoned her under the pretense of mourning together, two widows sharing their grief. Then she had her killed. No hesitation, no remorse recorded anywhere in the ancient sources. Statira and her sister were murdered and their bodies thrown into a well. Roxana had assessed the board the moment Alexander stopped breathing and made her first move before most people had even understood the game had changed. This was not the act of a grieving wife. This was the act of a woman who had been paying attention for 11 years, who had watched how power moved through that court, who understood that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. It bought her time. But time in the world of the Diadochi was always running out. For 12 years she kept her son alive. 12 years of navigating between generals who smiled at her face and plotted against her back. 12 years of alliances built and broken. 12 years of watching the empire her husband had built dissolve piece by piece into the ambitions of men who had served him and now served only themselves. In 310 BC, Cassander, the man who controlled Macedonia, made his decision. Roxana and her son Alexander IV were quietly imprisoned, then quietly executed. The official story was kept as vague as possible, a footnote, an administrative necessity. The last heir of Alexander the Great was murdered in a dungeon at approximately 13 years old, and Roxana, the girl from the conquered people who had outlasted every other wife, every other rival, every other threat for over 2 decades, died in the same darkness. History gave Alexander 3 volumes. It gave Roxana a paragraph. But here is what that paragraph does not tell you. Roxana did not simply survive for 12 years through luck or loyalty or the goodwill of powerful men. She survived because she understood something that Alexander himself had tried to teach the world and failed. That the empire was never really about the man on the horse. It was about what happened the morning after the horse stopped moving. She just ran out of mornings. 800 years after Roxana died in a Macedonian dungeon, a woman stood barefoot in the snow. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, literally barefoot. In January, in the Alps, outside the gates of a castle called Canossa in northern Italy, in the year 1077, while the most powerful king in Europe knelt in the courtyard and begged a pope for forgiveness. His name was Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, and the woman standing beside him in that snow, the woman who had travelled through frozen mountain passes in the dead of winter, who had negotiated passage through hostile territory, who had kept her children safe and her household intact while her husband's entire political world collapsed around him, was his wife, Bertha of Savoy. History remembers Canossa as Henry's humiliation, his surrender, his defeat. History forgot to mention that Bertha made it possible for him to survive it. To understand what that means, you need to understand what the Holy Roman Empire actually was in the 11th century. It was not a country. It was not even really an empire in the traditional sense. It was a permanent negotiation between the emperor, the German princes who elected him, and above all, the Catholic Church, which held a power that no sword could fully answer. The Pope did not command armies in the conventional sense. He commanded something more dangerous. He commanded legitimacy. He decided who was a Christian king and who was an excommunicated heretic that any loyal Catholic could overthrow without sin. In 1076, Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Henry IV. Let that land for a moment. The Holy Roman Emperor, the man who theoretically ruled over the largest Christian kingdom in the world, was told by the Pope that he was outside the church, that his soul was damned, that any lord, any prince, any ambitious nobleman who wanted to take his throne now had the explicit blessing of God to do so. Within months, the German princes were meeting without him, electing a rival king, planning a future in which Henry IV simply did not exist. He had 1 year to get the excommunication lifted before they made that future permanent. 1 year to cross the Alps in winter, find the Pope, and humiliate himself so completely that Gregory VII would have no political choice but to readmit him to the Church. Because the rules of the game, the rules Gregory himself had written, said that a penitent sinner who truly submitted could not be refused absolution. Henry was not going to Canossa to beg. He was going to Canossa to win, to use the Pope's own theology as a weapon against him. But none of that works if he does not get there. And getting there meant crossing mountain passes that were frozen solid. With a court, with children, through territory controlled by princes who would have happily handed him to his enemies. It meant negotiating safe passage through lands owned by Matilda of Tuscany, a woman who was simultaneously one of Henry's most powerful opponents and the person controlling access to Canossa itself. It meant managing the logistics of moving a royal household across the most hostile geography in Europe in the worst possible season. Bertha managed it. Not loudly, not in ways that made it into the chronicles, because the chronicles were written by monks who were interested in the Pope and the Emperor and had very little space in their manuscripts for the woman who held everything together between them. But the evidence is there if you look for it. The negotiations, the safe conducts, the route, the timing. None of it happens without someone doing the work that strategy requires before strategy can be executed. Henry stood in the snow at Canossa for 3 days, barefoot, in a hair shirt, the universal symbol of total submission. Gregory made him wait, not because he was deciding, but because making the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire wait in the snow for 3 days was its own kind of message to every prince in Europe. On the 3rd day, Gregory lifted the excommunication. Henry IV survived. He went back to Germany. He fought the princes who had tried to replace him. He eventually drove Gregory VII into exile. He rebuilt everything that had seemed permanently destroyed in 1076. And Bertha? She died in 1087, 10 years after Canossa. The chronicles note her death in a single sentence: a devoted wife, a pious woman. Nothing about the Alpine crossing, nothing about the negotiations, nothing about the fact that without her, her husband would never have reached the castle where he saved his own reign. But here is what the single sentence does not tell you. Bertha of Savoy had been married to Henry IV since she was 6 years old. 6. Sent from her home in Savoy to the German court as a child bride, as part of a political arrangement between families who treated children like currency. She grew up inside a court that viewed her as a foreign attachment to a king who, by most accounts, had little interest in her for the first decade of their marriage. Henry reportedly tried to divorce her multiple times. She refused. Not out of sentiment, out of calculation. A divorced queen in the 11th century had nothing. A queen who survived her husband's worst crisis and stood beside him at Canossa had everything. She chose correctly. She always chose correctly. That is the part history buried under one sentence. There is a version of this story you already know. Henry VIII, 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. You learned it in school. You have seen the paintings, the wide silhouette, the small eyes, the expression of a man who has never been told no and has decided he never will be. You have seen the dramatizations, the miniseries, the films where Catherine of Aragon is the dignified first act before the real story begins with Anne Boleyn. That version of the story is a lie. Not in the details. The dates are correct. The sequence is correct. Henry did want an annulment. Anne Boleyn did become queen. Catherine did die alone in a cold castle in 1536, stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, refused even a final meeting with the child she had raised. The lie is in the framing. The lie is in the idea that Catherine of Aragon was a passive figure in her own story. A woman things happened to. A dignified victim who accepted her fate with grace and quiet suffering and the occasional tear that looked good in candlelight. Catherine of Aragon was the most legally sophisticated political fighter in 16th century Europe. And she nearly won. To understand what she was actually doing, you need to understand what Henry was asking for and why it was almost impossible to give him. Henry wanted the Pope to declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid. His argument was theological. Catherine had previously been married to his older brother Arthur, who had died young, and Leviticus contained a passage that seemed to prohibit a man from marrying his brother's widow. Henry wanted that passage used as the basis for an annulment. Not a divorce, an annulment. A declaration that the marriage had never existed in the eyes of God. The problem was Catherine, because Catherine had a counter-argument, and her counter-argument was airtight. Her marriage to Arthur, she maintained, had never been consummated. Arthur was sickly. He died 5 months after the wedding. Whatever the church law said about a brother's widow, it applied only to a real marriage, and her marriage to Arthur, she swore on her immortal soul, had been no marriage in the eyes of God because it had never been completed in the eyes of the church. She had been a virgin when she married Henry. She had the testimony of her own ladies-in-waiting. She had the theological precedent. She had, most importantly, the support of her nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe, who also happened to control Rome and therefore controlled the Pope, who would have to make the final ruling. Henry could not get his annulment as long as Catherine refused to cooperate with it. So Catherine refused. For 6 years she refused. 6 years of pressure that would have broken most people. Henry removed her from court. She refused to leave quietly. He cut off access to her daughter Mary. She kept writing letters to her nephew, to the Pope, to sympathetic nobles, to anyone who had the power to slow the machinery grinding toward her destruction. He had her declared no longer queen. She signed every subsequent letter Caterina the Queen, Catherine the Queen, in defiance of a king who had the power to imprison her, humiliate her, isolate her, but could not make her agree that she was not his wife. Because the moment she agreed, it was over. Not just for her daughter. Mary's legitimacy depended entirely on Catherine's marriage being real. If Catherine admitted the marriage had been invalid, Mary became illegitimate, a bastard, removed from the succession, erased. Catherine was not fighting for herself. She had understood since the beginning that she was probably not going to survive this. She was fighting for her daughter. She fought with legal briefs and theological arguments and an absolute refusal to give Henry the one thing he needed, her consent. She understood that in a legal and ecclesiastical process, the defendant has power as long as they refuse to yield. She turned her own trial into a siege. And like every siege in history, the question was simply which side ran out of resources first. Henry had England, Catherine had principle and time. In the end, Henry did what every ruler does when the law refuses to give him what he wants. He changed the law. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the head of the Church of England. No more Pope, no more Roman process, no more appeal to Rome that Catherine could use as a shield. With one piece of legislation, he made her entire legal strategy obsolete overnight. She was moved to Kimbolton Castle, cold, draughty, deliberately chosen for its discomfort. Her household was reduced, her correspondence was monitored, she was allowed almost no visitors. The woman who had been Queen of England for 24 years was essentially imprisoned in a crumbling manor house in the middle of nowhere and told to be grateful she was still alive. She kept writing letters, she kept signing them Caterina the Queen. She died in January 1536, alone except for a handful of loyal servants. The official cause was cancer. Some historians have suggested something darker. The Spanish ambassador who saw her in her final weeks noted that her heart, when examined after death, was entirely black on one side, in a way that seemed unusual even to 16th century physicians. Henry celebrated when he heard the news. He dressed in yellow, the colour of celebration in Tudor England, and held a banquet. He had won, or so he thought. Because what Henry did not understand, what he could not understand because he was a man who measured victory in territory and submission, was that Catherine's refusal had already done its damage. The 6 years she had spent fighting had fractured the English court, had driven a wedge between Henry and half of Catholic Europe, had forced him to break with Rome in a way that unleashed forces he could never fully control. The English Reformation, the thing that split Christianity in England permanently, that shaped the next 4 centuries of British history, happened in significant part because one woman refused to sign a piece of paper. She never signed it. They buried her not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales, Arthur's widow, Henry's argument made permanent even in death. Her daughter Mary became Queen of England anyway. Catherine had been right about that part. Before we continue, if you are still here, if you have followed these women from a Macedonian dungeon to a frozen alpine pass to a crumbling castle in England, you are not a casual viewer. You already know that. The stories we are telling tonight are not in your textbooks. They are not in the documentaries your school showed you. They exist in the margins of history, in letters that almost did not survive, in court records written by men who tried to minimize what they were witnessing, in archaeological evidence that spent centuries being misattributed or ignored. Finding them takes time, verifying them takes longer, building them into something worthy of the women who lived them. That is what we do here, every single week. If that matters to you, if you believe these stories deserve to exist, consider joining the lineage, our inner circle, the people who make it possible for us to spend weeks on a single episode instead of cutting corners. Members get early access, direct influence over which stories we open next, and the knowledge that they are part of something that refuses to let history stay buried. The link is below. The decision is yours. Because we still have 3 women left to meet tonight, and the next one makes everything you have heard so far look almost peaceful by comparison. She was the last empress of Byzantium. She watched 1,000 years of civilization fall in a single afternoon. And when the conqueror's soldiers came through the gates of Constantinople, she made a choice that history recorded as surrender. It was not surrender. It was the most sophisticated act of survival in the medieval world. On the 29th of May, 1453, the Roman Empire ended. Not the empire you were thinking of, not the toga-wearing, gladiator-fighting, Caesar-assassinating Rome of the history books. That Rome had been gone for 1,000 years. This was the other Rome, the eastern half. The half that survived every barbarian invasion, every plague, every internal collapse that destroyed its western twin. The Byzantine Empire, a civilization that had preserved Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian theology through a millennium of chaos, while Western Europe was burning its own libraries and calling it progress. It ended in an afternoon. Mehmed II, 21 years old, the Ottoman Sultan who had been told by his own advisors that Constantinople was impregnable, brought 70,000 soldiers and the largest cannons the world had ever seen to the walls of a city defended by fewer than 7,000 men. The walls had stood for 1,000 years. They fell in 53 days. When the Ottoman soldiers came through the gates, Constantinople became Istanbul, and the woman who had been its empress disappeared. Her name was Helena Dragash, wife of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, who died fighting on the walls that morning. Not fleeing, not surrendering, but pulling off his imperial regalia and charging into the breach with his soldiers so that no one would ever be able to display his body as a trophy. He was never identified among the dead. He simply vanished into the collapse of everything he had tried to hold together. Helena was not in Constantinople when it fell. That is the detail that changes everything. 3 years before the final siege, Constantine XI had sent her away. The official reason was her health. The real reason was visible to anyone paying attention. Constantine knew what was coming. He had been watching the Ottoman encirclement for years. He had sent desperate letters to the Pope, to Venice, to every Christian power in Europe, begging for reinforcements that never came. He had done the mathematics and understood that the city was not going to survive, and he made a decision that history has almost entirely overlooked. He got his wife out. Helena spent the fall of Constantinople in the Peloponnese, in the Byzantine territory her brothers controlled. When the news arrived, the city gone, the emperor dead, 1,000 years of civilization erased in a single day, she did not collapse. She did not flee to a convent. She did not disappear into grief. She converted to Catholicism and wrote to the Pope. Understand what that move required. Helena was Greek Orthodox, as deeply Orthodox as it was possible to be, the wife of the last defender of Orthodox Constantinople. Converting to Catholicism was not a spiritual decision, it was a political calculation of extraordinary precision. The Pope was the only power in Europe with both the motivation and the theoretical authority to organize a crusade to retake Constantinople. Helena needed his attention. She needed his protection. She needed to transform herself from a defeated empress with no territory, no army, and no leverage into something the most powerful religious figure in the Western world would find valuable enough to support. She gave him her conversion. He gave her his patronage. She spent her remaining years in Rome under papal protection, corresponding with every Christian monarch in Europe, keeping alive the political idea that Constantinople could be retaken, that Byzantium was not finished, that the empire existed as long as its legitimate heir existed. It was never retaken. The crusade never came. The empire never returned. But Helena Dragaš died in Rome in 1473, 20 years after the fall, as a recognized empress, protected, respected. Surrounded by the scholars and theologians she had brought with her from the dying world of Byzantium, those scholars carried Greek manuscripts that had survived the Ottoman conquest. Those manuscripts seeded the Italian Renaissance. The woman who watched 1,000 years of civilization fall in an afternoon spent the next 20 years making sure that civilization's knowledge did not fall with it. History calls 1453 an ending. Helena made it a beginning. Пятая женщина. Дайме Гоадзен. Жена японского военного правителя. Everything you have heard so far happened in the Western world. Greece, the Holy Roman Empire, England, Byzantium. Conquerors who spoke Latin or Turkish or French, who fought under crosses and crescents, who recorded their victories in manuscripts that eventually made it into European universities and European curriculums and European textbooks. Now go east. 12th century Japan, a world so different from medieval Europe that the two civilizations might as well have been on separate planets. Different language, different religion, different architecture, different food, different concept of honor, of loyalty, of what it meant to fight and what it meant to lose. But the same morning, the same breathless rider, the same impossible calculation. Her name was Tomoe Gozen, and she was not like any woman we have met tonight. She was a samurai, not a samurai's wife who learned to hold herself with dignity while her husband fought. Not a noble woman who survived through intelligence and negotiation and letters written in careful diplomatic language. A samurai, a warrior. Trained from childhood in horseback riding, archery, and the use of the naginata, the curved blade on a long pole that was the weapon of choice for Japanese fighters who needed reach and speed over brute strength. She rode into battle, personally, repeatedly. Her husband, or more precisely the man she served, the warlord Minamoto no Yoshinaka, was one of the most brilliant and most catastrophically self-destructive military commanders in Japanese history. He was the first of the Minamoto clan to capture Kyoto during the Genpei War, the civil war that tore Japan apart in the 1180s between two great clans, the Minamoto and the Taira. He took the imperial capital. He stood at the peak of everything. Then he managed to alienate every single ally he had within months of arriving. He insulted the imperial court. He let his soldiers loot the city. He positioned himself as a rival to his own cousin Yoritomo, the man who would eventually become the first shogun of unified Japan, rather than serving under him. By 1184, Yoritomo had sent an army to destroy him. At the Battle of Awazu, outnumbered and betrayed, Yoshinaka's forces collapsed. The ancient sources, the Heike Monogatari, the great epic chronicle of the Genpei War, record what happened in the final hours with a detail that stops you cold. Yoshinaka, knowing he was finished, turned to Tomoe and gave her an order. He told her to leave. Not because she could not fight, she had already proven that. The chronicles record that in the chaos of the final battle, she personally killed one of the enemy's most feared warriors, took his head as a trophy, the ultimate proof of victory in samurai culture, and fought through the encircling army to reach Yoshinaka's side. She had done everything a samurai was supposed to do. He told her to leave because he did not want to die with a woman beside him. In the culture of 12th century Japanese warfare, a commander's last stand was supposed to be a specific kind of death, a male death, witnessed by male warriors, recorded in a specific way. Her presence complicated that, so she left. What happened next is where history fractures into competing versions. One account says she became a nun, that she spent the rest of her life in a convent, praying for the soul of the man she had served and fought beside, and possibly loved. A clean ending, a spiritual resolution that made the monks who recorded it comfortable. Another account says something entirely different, that she did not go quietly into a convent, that she was captured by one of Yoritomo's commanders, a man named Wada Yoshimori, who had heard the stories of what she had done at Owazu and wanted her, not as a prisoner, not as a trophy, but as a wife. That she agreed, that she had children, that she lived into old age as the matriarch of a warrior family, teaching her sons the same skills she had used on the battlefield. That she survived. Historians cannot agree on which version is true. The sources contradict each other. The chronicles were written decades after the events they describe, by men who had reasons to shape the story in particular directions. But here is what no version disputes. At the Battle of Owazu, in the final collapse of everything she had served, Tomoe Gozen did not surrender, did not freeze, did not wait for someone to tell her what to do. She fought her way through an encircling army, took ahead, and then made a decision about her own survival with the same cold precision she had used on the battlefield. Whatever happened after that, convent or marriage or something the records never captured, she chose it. In a world that gave women almost no choices at all, that matters more than the specific answer. Hürrem Sultan. Every woman we have met tonight started with power and lost it. This one started with nothing. Somewhere in the early 16th century, the exact date is lost because no one thought it was worth recording, a young girl was taken from her home in what is now western Ukraine. She was captured during a Crimean Tatar raid, the kind of raid that happened regularly in that part of the world, that emptied villages overnight, that fed a slave trade stretching from the Black Sea to the markets of Constantinople. She had a name. Her family called her Anastasia. The Ottoman slave market gave her a different future. She was purchased for the imperial harem of Suleiman the Magnificent, the longest reigning sultan in Ottoman history, the man who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, who personally led 13 military campaigns, who was called by his enemies in Europe the most dangerous man alive. His harem contained hundreds of women, concubines, servants, entertainers, a world within a world governed by its own brutal hierarchy, where position meant survival and invisibility meant erasure. Anastasia became Hürrem, and Hürrem became the most powerful woman in the history of the Ottoman Empire. Not by accident, not by luck, not because Suleiman happened to fall in love with her and she happened to benefit from that love. By strategy, by intelligence, by a 20-year campaign conducted entirely within the walls of a palace, without an army, without a title, without any of the conventional instruments of power, and more effective than most military campaigns of the era. She started by making herself indispensable. The Ottoman system was specifically designed to prevent any single woman from gaining too much influence. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, held the real power in the harem. Concubines were kept deliberately separated, deliberately competitive, deliberately isolated from the Sultan's political world. The system had worked for generations. It was efficient, it was ruthless, it was considered unbreakable. Hürrem broke it inside a decade. She learned Ottoman Turkish, then Arabic, then Persian. She wrote poetry, genuinely accomplished poetry that Suleiman valued not as a consort's flattery, but as a literary peer's work. She made herself the person he wanted to talk to, not just the person he wanted to be with. In a court full of concubines who competed for his physical attention, she competed for something more durable, his mind. Then she did something no woman in Ottoman history had ever done. She asked Suleiman to marry her. The reaction in the court was immediate and almost unanimous. Impossible, scandalous. The Sultan did not marry his concubines. That was the entire point of the concubine system. Marriage implied equality. Marriage implied legal rights. Marriage implied that one woman had a status above all others in a system built specifically to prevent any woman from achieving that status. Suleiman married her anyway. In 1533 or 1534, the sources disagree on the exact year, he freed her from concubinage and made her his legal wife. Hurrem Sultan, the first concubine in Ottoman history to receive that title. The court was furious. The Janissaries rioted, not directly over the marriage, but in the general atmosphere of outrage that surrounded it. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's closest friend and most powerful advisor, made his opposition known through every channel available to him. Ibrahim Pasha was executed in 1536. The official reason was political. There were genuine charges, overreach, suspected disloyalty, financial corruption. But the timing and the identity of the person who had the most to gain from his removal was not lost on anyone in the Ottoman court then, and is not lost on historians now. Hurrem had identified the one person powerful enough to counterbalance her influence, and removed him. Not with a blade, with patience, with information. With the 17 years of observation she had spent inside a palace, learning exactly how power moved through its corridors and exactly which walls could be undermined from the inside. She then did something even more remarkable. She left the harem, physically. She moved her residence from the old palace, the traditional home of the imperial harem, to the Topkapi Palace, where the Sultan conducted the actual business of governing the empire. For the first time in Ottoman history, the Sultan's wife lived in the same complex as the Sultan's government. She was present, physically proximate to power in a way no woman had been before. Ambassadors began writing home about her. The Venetian and Polish ambassadors, men whose job was to understand Ottoman power and report on it accurately, noted with a mixture of fascination and alarm that she seemed to have genuine political influence. That Suleiman consulted her. That letters sent to her from foreign courts received replies that demonstrated real knowledge of the political situation. She was conducting foreign policy from inside a harem that was supposed to keep her isolated from the world. She also built things: hospitals, a women's mosque in Jerusalem, a soup kitchen in Constantinople that fed hundreds of people daily. Not as charity, as infrastructure, as the physical manifestation of a power that the Ottoman system had no official category for. A woman who governed without a title that acknowledged she governed. She died in 1558, still married to Suleiman, still in Topkapi Palace, still at the center of the world she had built from a slave market in Constantinople 4 decades earlier. Suleiman was reportedly devastated. He wrote her poetry after her death. He never remarried. The girl from the Ukrainian village who had no name in the Ottoman records when she arrived, she outlasted every enemy, every rival, every institutional barrier designed to contain her, and died exactly where she had decided she was going to die, at the center of everything. We have spent this entire video following women who survived, who fought, who negotiated, who converted religions and changed legal systems, and conducted foreign policy from inside locked palaces, and rode into battle and refused to sign pieces of paper that would have erased their children from history. And there is a danger in that, a comfortable lie that these stories can accidentally tell if you are not paying attention. The lie is this: that intelligence and courage and strategic brilliance were enough, that the women who had those qualities survived and the ones who did not were simply less capable, that history is a meritocracy if you look at it from the right angle. It was not. For every Roxana, there were 100 women whose names we will never know because they did not survive long enough to leave a record. For every Hurrem Sultan who rewrote the rules of an entire institution, there were hundreds of women in that same harem who disappeared into it without a trace. For every Catherine of Aragon who fought for 6 years and forced a king to break with Rome, there were women who faced the same machinery and were simply ground through it before anyone thought to write down what was happening. Survival was not a reward for merit. It was a combination of intelligence, timing, resources, and a quantity of pure chance that no amount of strategic brilliance could fully compensate for. And for the ones who did not survive, the ones history processed and discarded and forgot, we need to say that plainly. Because the alternative is a story that flatters us, that tells us the world rewards the deserving, that the women who disappeared simply did not fight hard enough. They fought. The records are just gone. Consider what happened to the wives of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma when Cortés arrived in 1519. Moctezuma had hundreds of wives. When the Spanish conquest was complete, those women were distributed, given to Spanish soldiers as servants, as concubines, as domestic property. Some were baptized and renamed. Some disappeared into the colonial system so completely that their original identities became unrecoverable within a single generation. A handful converted strategic assets, language skills, knowledge of Aztec court protocol, into positions of marginal safety inside the new order. Most did not. Consider the wives of the Romanov dynasty after 1917, the Grand Duchesses, the women of the extended imperial family who were not in the immediate line of succession and therefore did not make it into the history books as primary victims. Some escaped to Europe, some married quickly into foreign nobility and vanished into the background of the 20th century. Some were caught, some were shot in basements, some survived in conditions that the word survival does not adequately describe. Consider the pattern that runs through every conquered court in every era of human history. The victors took what they wanted. The women who had value, political value, dynastic value, symbolic value, were absorbed into the new order on terms the new order dictated. The women who had no obvious value to the conqueror were left to whatever the conqueror's soldiers decided to do with them. There was no international law, no convention, no institution that existed to protect them. There was only speed, intelligence, the ability to make yourself valuable to the new power before the new power decided you were a problem. And luck, always luck. This is the part of the story that the comfortable version leaves out. The version that focuses only on the survivors, on Roxana and Bertha and Catherine and Helena and Tomoe and Hurrem. That version is true, but it is incomplete. It shows you the exceptions and calls them the rule. The rule was darker. The rule was that when a king fell, the women around him fell too. Differently, more quietly, in ways that left fewer records and required less ink, because the people doing the recording did not consider what was happening to them worth the ink. We are considering it now. Because the measure of what Roxana did and what Catherine did and what Helena did and what Hurrem did is not just their individual brilliance. It is the size of the odds they were calculating against. It is the weight of the system pressing down on every decision they made. It is the knowledge, which they all had clearly because you can see it in every move they made, that the default outcome was erasure. They knew the default. They refused it anyway. That refusal, quiet, persistent, conducted without armies or titles or the official acknowledgement of anyone who held power, is the story that history tried to bury, and it is the most important story of all. There is an inscription on a wall in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Most tourists walk past it. It is not on the official tour. It is not in the guidebooks. It is in a corridor that connects the harem to the administrative quarters of the palace, the exact physical space where the world of women and the world of power were supposed to be kept permanently separate. Someone had it put there anyway. History does not record who. That anonymity is appropriate, because everything we have talked about tonight lived in that space, in the gap between the world that was supposed to exist and the world that actually did, between the official record and the reality behind it, between the name in the textbook and the person who actually made the decisions that the textbook attributed to someone else. We started tonight with a number. Over 400 defeated kings recorded by history. Fewer than 12 of their wives with a Wikipedia page. Here is another number. The decisions made by the women in this video, Roxana's elimination of her rival, Bertha's Alpine negotiation, Catherine's 6-year legal siege, Helena's conversion and the manuscripts she carried to Rome, Tomoe's choice on the battlefield at Awazu, Hurrem's dismantling of a system built to contain her, those decisions shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the next several centuries. The English Reformation that Catherine's refusal helped trigger reshaped Christianity across the entire English-speaking world. The Greek manuscripts that Helena's scholars carried to Italy seeded the intellectual movement that produced modern science. The Ottoman administrative model that Hurrem's influence helped reshape governed a territory of 30 million people for 4 more centuries. The legal precedents that Roxana's case established about royal succession echoed through Hellenistic law for generations. These women did not just survive, they rewrote the future. Without a throne, without an army, without a single official title that acknowledged what they were actually doing. And history looked at all of that and wrote one sentence. A devoted wife, a pious woman, died in such and such a year. We need to talk about why. Because it was not incompetence. The historians who recorded these events were not stupid men who simply failed to notice what was in front of them. They noticed. The Venetian ambassadors who wrote home about Hurrem's political influence noticed. The chroniclers who recorded Bertha's presence at Canossa noticed. The Spanish ambassador who watched Catherine of Aragon conduct her legal defense noticed, and wrote about it in terms of open admiration. They noticed, and they minimized anyway. Because acknowledging what these women were actually doing required acknowledging something that the political and intellectual architecture of their world was built to deny. That power did not live only where power was supposed to live. That the official map of who mattered and who did not was wrong. That the women who were supposed to be furniture in the rooms where history happened were sometimes the ones deciding what happened in those rooms. That admission had consequences. If a queen with no official political role could conduct foreign policy, what did that say about the official political role? If a woman in a harem could dismantle the most powerful institutional barrier in the Ottoman world, what did that say about institutional barriers in general? If Catherine of Aragon, a woman, a foreigner, a wife being discarded, could hold the King of England and the Pope and the entire machinery of Tudor government in legal deadlock for 6 years, using nothing but her own intelligence and refusal, what did that say about the system that was supposed to make that impossible? It said the system was a story, a useful story, a story that kept most people in their designated places most of the time, but a story nonetheless. And the women in this video had figured that out. They had looked at the story and identified the gaps. And in the gaps, in the space between what was supposed to be true and what was actually true, they had built something real. That is what history buried. Not the facts. The facts were always there for anyone willing to look. What history buried was the implication. The uncomfortable suggestion that the official version of power, who had it, who was allowed to have it, who history would credit with having it, was always partially fiction. These women knew it was fiction. They lived in the gap. And in that gap, with nothing but intelligence and nerve and the precise understanding of what the people around them actually wanted versus what they officially claimed to want, they changed the world. Without anyone writing it down properly, until now. History is written by the victors. You have heard that 1,000 times. It is one of those phrases that gets repeated so often it stops meaning anything. A bumper sticker, a cynical observation at a dinner party, something people say and then move on from, without sitting with what it actually implies. Sit with it for a moment. If history is written by the victors, what happens to the stories of the people who were neither victors nor defeated? The people who existed in the margins of someone else's war, who survived not by winning but by refusing to be erased, who left traces so faint that finding them requires looking in places historians were never trained to look. Those stories do not get written by the victors. They barely get written at all. Roxana kept her son alive for 12 years in a world that wanted him dead. Then she was murdered in a dungeon and given a paragraph. Bertha crossed the Alps in January and saved her husband's reign and got 1 sentence. Catherine held the King of England in legal deadlock for 6 years and became a footnote to Anne Boleyn's story. Helena carried a civilization's knowledge out of a burning city, and history called it 1453 and moved on. Tomoe fought her way through an encircling army, and history cannot even agree on whether she lived or died afterward. Hurrem dismantled a centuries-old institution from the inside and got a reputation as a manipulator. That word, manipulator. Notice how it works. When a man uses intelligence and patience and precise understanding of human motivation to achieve a political goal, that is called strategy. It is celebrated. It gets its own chapter. When a woman uses the exact same tools in the exact same service of the exact same goal, it is called manipulation. It is treated as evidence of something slightly sinister. Something that requires an explanation beyond simple competence. The word tells you everything about who wrote the history. These women were not manipulators. They were strategists, operating in a world that had deliberately removed every official instrument of strategy from their hands, and then expressed surprise and suspicion when they built their own. They built their own anyway. And the civilization you live in, the legal frameworks, the intellectual traditions, the religious structures, the political precedents that shape your daily life in ways you will never fully trace, carries their fingerprints, invisibly, unacknowledged, present nonetheless. That is their legacy. Not a Wikipedia page, not a monument, not a chapter in a textbook. Something quieter and more durable than any of those things. The simple fact that the world turned out differently because they existed, because they refused, because they looked at the default outcome, erasure, submission, disappearance, and chose something else, with everything stacked against them, every time. If you are still here, if you have followed these women across 2,000 years and 6 continents and refused to look away from what history tried to hide, then you already understand why this channel exists. We are not here to make history comfortable. We are not here to give you the version that flatters the people who wrote it. We are here for the version underneath, the one that takes longer to find and hits harder when you do. Subscribe if you are not subscribed. Share this with someone who still thinks history is just kings and battles. Leave a comment and tell us which of these women hit hardest. And remember, the ones history forgot were not forgettable. They were just inconvenient. You are watching Primeval History, the best dark history channel in the world.